This is part one of a three-part series on plagiarism. This part will be given as a PPT. Other parts will be readings from your book and other materials to help you with citing correctly. The examples in this PPT will be taken from the passage Be Specific on page 309 in the textbook Models for Writers, the 12th edition. If you don't have that textbook, you can use the PDF link here to refer to the passage. However, be aware that you will need the book for future assignments. Okay, on this slide, you see the dictionary definition of plagiarism, and I really want you to pay attention to the underlined portion. Using or closely imitating the language and thoughts. Okay, what this essentially means is anytime you copy the words or the ideas of another author and you do not give credit to that author, you are plagiarizing. So sometimes you may think you put the idea in your own words, so you don't need to cite the source. However, you do need to cite the source. And so in the next few slides, we're going to review some examples of plagiarism that will hopefully give you a clear idea of what is and what is not plagiarism when you're looking at other sources. The most obvious type of plagiarism is when you copy the words directly from a source without quotation marks. Even if you use the name of the author, if you don't use quotation marks to tell us which words are the author's exact words and which words belong to you, you are still plagiarizing. Look again at the sentence at the top as it is written in plagiarized form. You can see there's no indication of which words belong to Goldberg. At the bottom, you can see the way the sentence should read in order to tell us exactly what Goldberg said. Goldberg tells the reader to, quote, be specific, give things the dignity of their names, unquote. Now, you can see the be is in brackets. That is because I changed the form of the word to make it more grammatically correct. Whenever you change a form, either a letter or short word, to make it more grammatically correct, you put that portion in brackets. You can never change the meaning of the quote, but you can change the form of the word to fit the sentence. In addition, you see those three dots after specific? That is called an ellipsis. An ellipsis indicates that you have left out information from the original. So this tells us you're not including everything Goldberg said between those two sentences. You're just including the parts that are important. Another case of plagiarism is when you do use quotation marks and you use the correct punctuation, but you forget to cite the author. We always need to know exactly where the information comes from. So you can see the original at the top, and at the bottom of the slide, you see the correction. We kept the quotation the same. All we did was add in the last name of the author and the page number where the information comes from. Now, there is an argument about whether the author and the page number should be in parentheses before the period, after the period, inside the quotation marks, outside the quotation marks. Most people do put it before the period and inside the quotation marks, as you see here. Personally, I'm not particularly picky about it as long as the information is there in some format connected to the quotation. But some instructors will be very particular, so make sure you're doing what your instructor requires you to do. This is a type of plagiarism that I mentioned at the beginning when we were going over the definition. This is a case where the writer used their own words to express the author's idea. However, the author still needs to be cited in order for this not to be plagiarism. Comparing the two examples on this slide, at the top you see there is no author identification. In the example at the bottom, you see the author's last name and the page number of the text where the information is found. Both of those are in parentheses inside the period. Another source of plagiarism is when you summarize an idea of an article or book or longer piece of writing, but you don't cite the author's name. You still need the cite. Anytime you get an idea from another source, you need to cite where that information comes from. When you compare the examples here, at the top we have the incorrect version. At the bottom we have the corrected version. Now you notice we only have the author's last name. We don't have a page number. This is because we're not paraphrasing one or two specific sentences. We're talking about her general idea for the whole passage that she wrote. So there is no specific location. Therefore, you just include her last name. This example of plagiarism is a little bit tricky. Okay, here you have developed your own ideas after reading one or more sources. So you don't really need to cite the source in the text because the ideas belong to you and the words belong to you. However, you do need to make sure you cite the sources at the end of the text so that you give your readers an idea of where you got influence for the writing that you have done. In this course, we're going to use a citation style called MLA, the Modern Language Association citation style. For MLA, the works at the end are created under a works cited section. And there's an example of this on the last slide because I've cited my sources here in MLA style. So just be aware that you have to cite all of your sources at the end of a paper, whether or not you actually quote or paraphrase them within the source. You don't have to cite every idea that you inform people about in a paper. When you write about ideas commonly known to your audience that you have learned from multiple sources and that can easily be tracked, there's no need to cite them. So in this case, virtually all people and objects have specific names. Even though the author said something very similar in her writing, you don't need to cite that because this is general knowledge. It's common sense. If you look at an object or you see a person, you know there is a specific name attached to that object or person. So there's no need to cite that information. Other times, it's a little tricky to decide whether or not to cite something. For example, in our culture, when we talk about Martin Luther King gave a famous speech, I have a dream, we don't need to cite it because Martin Luther King and his accomplishments are very familiar to our culture. But if you talk about a leader from your culture doing something important and you are presenting it to an American audience, you should cite for the American audience because Americans will not be familiar with this information. So yes, sometimes it is tricky to know when to cite and when not to cite. If you are not sure, cite the information. That's the safest way in American academics. Something else you don't have to cite is when you develop your own analysis of ideas based on what you have researched. So you've cited the evidence and you draw your own conclusion. In this example, virtually all people and objects have specific names. Good writers know how to use these names to create a picture for the audience. This is an independent conclusion drawn from your thinking. There's no need to cite it. For this course of study, or whenever you're studying in an American educational institution, you need to be aware of types of academic plagiarism. It's not limited to copying words or ideas from a source without citing. Below on this slide are several other examples. For example, having a friend or other person look over your writing and make corrections for you is plagiarism. Having someone else write the paper for you is plagiarism. Writing the paper in your language, then using a translation source to write it in English is another example. Collaborating with another person without permission from the instructor to compare sources and information can also be considered plagiarism. Submitting a paper that you used in one class for another class without permission from both instructors would be considered plagiarism. Using information from a previous paper, even though it is your idea, in a new paper without citing and without permission from the instructor can be considered plagiarism. So essentially, anytime you have someone else do all or part of your work, that will be considered plagiarism. Sometimes, even though it is your own work, it could be considered plagiarism. So if you're not sure, talk to your instructor. The problem that arises here is you submit work that has been previously graded, meaning someone has already corrected it for you. It gives you an unfair academic advantage. So the instructor wants to make sure all students have a fair shot at getting the best grade, and all students have what we call a level playing field. So just talk to your instructor before you submit an assignment for a final grade, just to make sure you're doing everything correctly. Plagiarism has serious consequences for students. The most obvious consequence is that a student will typically get a 0 on the assignment that was plagiarized. However, some other things that can happen are that the instructor will lose trust in the student Future work will be suspected as being plagiarized, and the relationship between the teacher and student will be damaged. This one might not be quite as important to you, but students take away their opportunity to learn and develop critical thinking skills that can be useful later if they simply rely on the words and ideas of others. And finally, institutions that ignore plagiarism lose the trust and respect of the public, at least in the U.S. This can result in a loss of reputation and revenue, and institutions are very protective of both their reputation and their financial health. So UCLA has a very strict policy on plagiarism. The policy on this PPT slide is directly copied from your syllabus. Okay, so you can refer to your syllabus, you can refer back to this slide. But be aware, this is what UCLA considers to be plagiarism. Copying directly from a book without quotations or citations, submitting someone else's paper as your own, or paraphrases or summaries that are too close in vocabulary and sentence structure to the author's original text and ideas. Now, most of you are probably aware that number 1 and number 2 are a problem. Number 3, the paraphrases and summaries are where a lot of my students get in trouble. So you really want to look up and practice paraphrasing information effectively and making sure you're citing the sources where you get the ideas from. An incidence of plagiarism at UCLA, whether spoken or written work, intentional or unintentional, will result in a 0 for the assignment and may result in disciplinary action. As you know by now, we avoid plagiarism by citing sources. Citing is important in the U.S. for a number of reasons. First, Americans maintain pride in their individuality. They want credit for original new ideas and creations. We are an individualistic nation, and we do have a certain sense of achievement for things that we come up with by ourselves, and so we want credit for those achievements. Second, having original ideas can boost one's reputation in academic and professional circles. This can lead to closer relationships. It can lead to promotions in the future. For many academics, it can lead to the chance to write papers, present papers, write books, whatever. So it leads to a lot of opportunities. And third, original ideas and creations are a source of revenue for both academics and professionals in other fields. These books pay money. These ideas can pay money. So when someone copies or steals ideas, it is possible they are actually stealing financially from another person. Different academic and professional areas have specific forms of citation that are used. The forms indicate how the source will be recognized in the writing and at the end of the paper. You don't have to learn all of the forms. For this course, we'll use MLA, as I mentioned before, but I do want you to be aware of other common forms of citation because you may need them in your courses. Another general common form is APA, otherwise known as the American Psychological Association. There's also Chicago, Turabian, and IEEE. In addition to these forms, there are a few others that are out there for smaller fields and smaller domains. So it's important to know which style is required for each course in the program here and which style may be required for you professionally. When you cite a source, you cite in 2 different locations. You cite inside the body of the paper, okay, the essay, the research paper, the summary note, whatever it is, and you cite at the end of the paper. So in the text, the citation is used as a signal. It signals which words and ideas are not your own. This is the part we've covered extensively. However, just as importantly, a citation also signals which source to look for at the end of the paper to get more information. If a reader is interested in the idea that you quoted or paraphrased, this citation signals them where they can find the other publishing information, the book name, the website, the page numbers, to read more about what you have written. You must cite every time you use an idea from another source. It's not enough to cite once in a paragraph if you have multiple sentences coming from another source, especially if these sentences are paraphrased. Now, if you quote multiple sentences, which is never really a good idea, okay, for the essays you're writing here, but if you quote multiple sentences, you can cite just once at the end of the quote. However, if you paraphrase multiple sentences, it is best and clearest to put the citation at the end of each sentence, even if it is the same name. In your next lesson on citations, you're going to read about and summarize how to cite in MLA style. Following that, there will be a Part 2 PPT slide show, and in that slideshow, we'll look at specific instances of citations and how they look. So you'll look at how to cite using the author's name in parentheses and how to cite using the author's name within the sentence. Make sure you review this information and take the Part 1 quiz located in this week's module.